Heritage Council, which is our state historic preservation office here in Kentucky. I oversee the site development team, which is one of our 4 programs at the Kentucky Heritage Council. And within the site development program, our Rehabilitation Tax Credits and Preservation Easement portfolio is housed. So we're a team of, there's 5 of us in that program. So we are a small but mighty bunch, and we process close to 250 tax credit applications a year. So we stay busy. And what is a rehabilitation tax credit? The term rehabilitation is actually defined by the federal government. The Secretary of the Interior Standards defines it here. But in essence, what that means is they're looking to repair and maintain historic properties and what gives them their essence and their history, that architectural significance, making sure that they can convey their history, while also allowing for alterations to take place that allow the building to be occupiable in the contemporary age. Buildings that don't have indoor bathrooms are just not viable in our contemporary era. So a tax credit, or rehabilitation is preserving what we can and allowing alterations where we can, and then a tax credit is reducing the amount of income taxes that you owe to the government, either at the state level or at the federal level.
Question on that.
Yeah.
That sounds like a tax deduction.
It's different from tax deduction.
Okay, now, a tax credit is actually not reducing what you owe.
Correct.
It is
Covering what you owe.
No. A tax credit comes to you whether you owe money to the government or not. Under normal, like for example, if this is a Kentucky tax credit,
Right.
and if I owe nothing to Kentucky,
you're jumping the gun. We'll get into that. But to answer your question briefly now, Kentucky at the state level will issue you a check.
okay,
Because the credit is essentially covering what you owe, and if you don't owe that, they pay you that money. The feds do not do that. But we'll get to that.
okay.
But yeah, thanks for pointing that out. And yeah, I want this to be, it is very technical, and there are a lot of steps in the process. When you break it down into individual parts, no one part is that difficult, but there are a lot of components to the application process. So I want this to be very conversational and as accessible as possible. So if you have any questions, just let me know.
Before you flip, where is that? That's really nice.
This is downtown Bardstown. Or, I'm sorry, Frankfurt. This is Frankfurt. Yeah. And yeah, all the photos that I'm using in the slideshow are of historic districts. And essentially, historic districts, or I'm sorry, rehabilitation tax credits are in place to help offset the additional costs that may be incurred with repairing and maintaining a historic property. For anyone that owns a historic property in this room, you know that they can be costly. So the tax credit program is meant to help balance that out and to provide an incentive to spur that private investment into the property. But since there are tax monies involved, there's a higher level of rehabilitation, there's a higher level of expectation for how you treat that property and how it should be treated. And essentially the way tax credits work is the dollar amount that you put into the property that is qualifying rehabilitation expenses, a percentage of that has been given back to you in the form of a credit. And this is really in place because in the 50s and 60s, the country was underscored by a lot of demolition that was taking place, a lot of historic resources were being demolished, and people began to realize that there needed to be a balance. While development was necessary and good for the population growth, for general ways of life and how things were changing, people also understood that there needed to be a balance to that, and preserving the way that we used to live and maintaining our heritage was important. So finding that balance in today's age of preserving certain things that represent our culture, our people, our places, while allowing development in non-historic areas is the balance we're seeking to achieve and why the tax credits came to be. And this is just a sort of an overview of that timeline. In 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act was passed, which created the National Register of Historic Places and all of the state historic preservation offices, like the Kentucky Heritage Council. And those state offices were in charge of, and are still in charge, of implementing the federal mission and goals at the state level. So we are an extension of the federal government here locally, or regionally in the state. In 1986, the Tax Reform Act was passed, which created that federal Rehabilitation Tax Credit program. And that was really in response to, okay, we recognize that historic places are important, but now we're recognizing that they take a lot of money, so what can we do? So in 86, that was passed. In 2005, Kentucky made their own state program to help capture some of those properties that aren't eligible at the federal level, but are very much important to Kentucky's history here regionally. So in 2005, the Kentucky Tax Credit was created, and just this year it was updated. So we have a huge amount of money now. It's very competitive. We have one of the most robust tax credit programs in the country, which really speaks to the success over the last 18 years that our program has been for the state. We have $100 million to give out annually to properties. And that is, when I say every bit of that will be used up, it really will. This program is extremely popular. A lot of people are really dedicated to rehabilitating commercial and residential properties, and we see that this program is widely popular, and now we have the funds to really support Kentucky and its people. Yes?
Is that allotted by fiscal year or by?
Fiscal year. Yeah, and we'll get into that a little bit more as well in terms of fiscal deadlines and that sort of thing. But yeah, 100 million, as I said, we're now have one of the most robust programs in the country. And the update was really made possible, like I said, because it's been so popular for 18 years. And there's been concrete, measurable evidence that legislators were able to see that this program really provides a huge return on investment, and it invests in the people, places, and economics of Kentucky that can't be taken elsewhere. You can't pick up the building and take it to another state. This is a true investment in the state and its people and places. So as I said, with the Kentucky Heritage Council, and we're sort of your one-stop shop. You submit everything to us, and we coordinate on your behalf with sending your final application to the Department of Revenue. We coordinate and send your federal applications to the National Park Service. So we are your main point of contact here at the state for questions, applications, and we make our recommendation on your project up to our counterparts.
What does the National Park Service have to?
So they're the reviewing agency for federal applications.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because when you think National Park Service, I mean, you think of our parks, but the Preservation and National Historic Preservation Act is encased within that. And essentially it's thought of as our park system is natural resources. These are built resources, so they're in the same. The only thing that the Kentucky Heritage Council does not directly assist you with is the IRS. National Park Service and the IRS will contact you separately about awarding the federal credits to you. So there are two rehabilitation tax credit programs available. One is, as I said, the state program, and the other is the federal program. And they were modeled, the state program is modeled after the federal program, but it is a little looser, should I say, to try and encompass more property types and more types of structures. And what I mean by that, the federal applications only allow buildings. So your classic, four walls, roof. Structures at the state level can apply to dry glazed stone fences, fountains, objects, barns, bridges, things that are historically significant to our specific history here that the federal credit won't cover. So our state credit covers a lot of structures, which is really, really wonderful. It also covers all use types. So owner-occupied residential is allowed at the state level. Also nonprofits, tax-exempt entities like churches, they can all apply to the state program. The federal program is for income-producing properties only. So you have to be, it has to be showing that it's producing income for you on your federal taxes. A few other key differences that are worth pointing out is that the state credit, since we have that $100 million fiscal budget each year, we require that projects be captured within a 24-month timeline. And that's really to make sure that projects are progressing, are distinct, and scopes of work are clearly defined so that they don't go on and on and on. We want to have a clear 24-month project is complete, you'll receive your tax credits, and everyone will move on. The National Park Service, the IRS I should say, the IRS does not have a budget, so they allow you to sort of drag your project on and on and on their end. So you could have two applications in at the same time, one with a 24-month deadline for the state, and one that you can sort of linger on for the feds. And they have phasing options for that. And as I said, we have budget caps, not only our budget, but also individual projects have caps. The IRS does not have a budget, so they just give you a flat 20% credit on your qualifying expenses. And this is also sort of highlighting the differences. As I said, federal, it's income producing properties only, and you qualify for 20% credit. At the state, you can get a 30% owner-occupied residential credit, so if that's the home you live in. You can also get a 20% credit if you're tax exempt, or if you're, an other, like if you're applying for a wall, a statue, something that doesn't qualify as a traditional building, that would be in our other category, and that would qualify for 20%. And then this bit really interests a lot of people. You can actually double down on the tax credits and apply for a 20% state credit and a 20% federal credit for income producing properties and get a total 40% credit. So you get 20% for state income tax, 20% for federal income tax. Now, I should mention that, as I said earlier, the state program is a little more flexible. So in order to qualify for the owner-occupied or the 20% other property types, you have to meet a minimum $20,000 investment. For income-producing properties at both state and federal levels, you have to meet what's called an adjusted basis. And that essentially is the appraised value of the building at time of application minus the land. So it's, you'll need to have the actual building itself appraised, and whatever that cost or whatever that appraisal is, you'll have to invest that much into the building. So this program here, the 40%, is really meant for buildings that are in really rough shape, really dilapidated states, that have very, very low property values at this time. So just to throw that out there, it's a great incentive, 40% is incredible, but the building has to come into the program at a really low base value. So I sort of wanted to throw out some easy numbers as an example. So for example, at the state level, let's say you submitted a state application for an owner-occupied residence. You get a 30% tax credit. So that's, if you commit to spending $100,000 in qualifying expenses, you've done a lot of work, looks great, you've approved all the applications, you'll be awarded $30,000. Now, this comes back to the question you asked. Let's say you only owed $15,000. The Kentucky Department of Revenue will cover the $15,000 you owe and then issue you a check for the remaining $15,000. This is for the state only. The IRS will not issue you a refund. The state will. So this is a great incentive, especially for those owner-occupied residences where, your expenses may far exceed what you actually owe in income taxes. You'll get those expenses paid back to you. So state and federal applications are mirrored. So they have the same requirements. They're 3-part applications. And part 1 is confirming that your property is truly eligible for these programs. There is no fee associated with the part 1 application. So if you're unsure but interested, you think maybe my property could qualify, you can submit that part 1 or just email us informally, and you can get a determination on if your property qualifies for the program. Then the part 2 is the most sort of robust application. And we'll go into the part 2 application in greater detail here in a moment. But essentially the part 2 is the before rehabilitation state. So what the property looks like now, what you want to do to it, why you're wanting to do these things, or what state is it in. And then the part 3 you submit after the project is all done. And we just confirm that you have done, in fact, what you said that you were going to do, and it meets the federal standards for rehabilitation. So that's the 3-part applications, and like I said, there's 3 parts for state and 3 parts for federal. So if you're submitting for both, you got to submit, all 3 for both.
May I ask, how do they, what is it that they ask to determine whether the property is eligible? Like age, location?
Yeah. I'm so glad you asked, because that's the next slide. So the part 1 application is determining property eligibility, and you either have to be, the property has to be either individually listed on the National Register of Historic Places, or it has to be a contributor within a historic district that's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And this is an important distinction. One, because some local historic districts are not recognized as national register of historic properties. So making sure that you contact our office and confirm, is this local district that I'm located within on the National Register? And secondly, you may be in a property that doesn't contribute to the historic district. So if you're in, let's say a property like this, it may have been an infill, it may have been a demo and new construction, and unfortunately those do not qualify for the program. So you have to be either individually listed or contributing to the historic significance in that National Register district. So the Part 2 application, as I said, this is probably the most robust part of the work that you have to put into these project applications. And it's essentially you take a lot of photos of the property inside and out all around, and you give us a really robust description of what you plan to do. You also need to have your estimated costs of what it's going to cost you to do this work, with meeting the minimum $20,000 for owner-occupied or the adjusted basis for those income producing. So, go ahead.
Is that a standard form, or is it just a narrative that I look at?
Oh, this is just the narrative? Oh, you mean for the actual application?
Yes.
The application has, there's several parts in the description. So you list the feature. So let's say roof is the feature, and then there's a description place underneath that feature where you describe what you're going to do to it. So it's on the form, it breaks it down by feature and description.
And the cost is going to be itemized in each feature?
The cost, it doesn't have to be itemized per feature, but it does need to be a rough estimate of material costs and labor costs. And when we take that total, the total estimated cost is what we allocate for you, for your tax credit.
So it's a lump sum for the whole project?
Yes, yeah. And the Department of Revenue asks that we, and it's on the form, that it be broken down to the best of your ability by material and labor. Obviously, a lot of times, if you're hiring it out to a contractor, they're not going to itemize the material versus labor for you typically. But do your best to itemize that out. And if you're not able to, just list the total And as I mentioned earlier, the rehabilitation is a federally defined term, and there are standards for rehabilitation that are in place that we review your project against to confirm that what you're proposing to do is on balance meeting the intention of this program. So there's typically, I get a lot of questions about the Part 2 application, and a lot of them ask, why do I need interior photos if I'm only doing work to the exterior? And this is because we need photos of the entire building inside and out, because we review the project on balance. So what we don't want to have happen is you do some work to the exterior, we don't see the interior at all, and it turns out you've ripped out all this beautiful original hard, veneered woodwork throughout. That would potentially jeopardize your project. So we need to know the whole project on balance is appropriate and meeting the standards of rehabilitation. Even if that means you're doing no work to the inside, that's fine. Provide us before photos and after photos, and we can corroborate that indeed no work was done. The photo key plan is a requirement, both at the state and federal level. In fact, the federal application will send it back to us if we forward it without a photo key plan. And a photo key plan essentially allows the reviewer to look at a floor plan and know where you took photos from. So as illustrated here, imagine you walk to an X, you take a photo, and you would mark on your floor plan an arrow with a number, and on the back of that corresponding photograph, you would write that number. So like here, photo number 2 would be of the kitchen. On the back of the kitchen photo, you would write photo number 2. If you're moving walls and doing a lot of interior reconfiguration, we then also need existing and proposed floor plans to understand how things are changing, where things are going, what's being removed. But that's only required if you're doing substantial interior changes. And then the last common question that I get from this slide is, when can I capture these expenses? When should I submit my application? And the short answer is the best practice is to submit the application before you've begun work. That is the best way to ensure that your project will be reviewed. We can give you comment. We can guide you to a successful project. If you've already started tearing things out and you submit an application to us, you're at risk of denial, because at that point, we don't have the opportunity to inform you that that may jeopardize your project, or we don't have the opportunity to give you the resources to maybe save those materials.
How long does it take before you hear something back?
Typically, we shoot between 30 and 60 days, and I know that can seem like a long time for homeowners, but with the volume of projects that we get and the number of staff that we have, that's usually what it ends up being. It's 30 to 60 days. So we strive to do better, but we'll see. We are hiring. Just throwing that out there.
Is it possible to put a couple of projects in there to make it to the 20,000?
So you can have multiple scopes of work. So let's say you wanted to replace the roof and do some electrical work, and then also refinish your hardwood floors. You could do all 3 of those things in one project application and submit all of those under one application. We do not allow multiple applications to be submitted at one time. And what I mean by that is you can't submit an application for a roof in January and then say, oh, you know what, I want to do my hardwood floors now, and submit a separate one in March for the floors. They need to be combined. And if you feel that you'd like to add things to the scope of work, we do have an amendment form where you can amend and you can take things off, add things to your project. As long as you meet the minimum $20,000 investment, then we can sort of be flexible with you on that. But we cannot accept, if there's an active application under review, we cannot accept a new one or a separate one. Yes?
Can I have a project where some items are eligible and some are not?
Yes, you can. These are called qualifying rehabilitation expenses and non-qualifying rehabilitation expenses, or what we call QREs for short. So, for instance, and I'll actually get to this in a few slides, but I'll do a quick brief now as well. So, a qualifying expense is anything that meets the standards of rehabilitation, and it goes towards the repair, maintenance, preservation of that historic character of the house. A non-qualifying expense that may still be acceptable is an alteration that takes place outside of the home. For instance, a new addition at the back. It may not impact the historic building, but it doesn't qualify for historic tax credits. And
Kitchen cabinets.
kitchen cabinets do qualify, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. Because there's a lot of things that people think may not qualify that do in fact qualify, but we'll touch on that in just a second. Another common question we get is about the deadline. So we had a question earlier about if the $100 million is with the annual year or fiscal year, and it is associated with the fiscal year. So we send out, what we do is we accept all the applications for our fiscal calendar, which is from July to July. And we review all the requests that we have for credits, for tax credits. And we allocate or set aside money for your specific project out of that $100 million. And so that deadline, so to speak, to be in a certain year's fiscal year or allocation year is April 29th. So if it's really important to you that you're starting your project really soon and you're wanting to get going, then you have to meet that April 29th deadline to be in the 2023 pool. It just passed for 2023. But I will say, we review and approve projects all year long. This fiscal deadline is strictly associated with what year your money is coming out of. Which really the only time that this is really important to applicants is related to your timeline. So like I said, the state application is you have to finish your project within 24 months. So let's say that you've already done some work, which isn't best practice, but we do retroactively approve projects. Let's say you've already started some work and you want to go back and capture that. It may be very important to you that you're in a certain fiscal year's calendar so that you can go back and capture those expenses. If you're following best practices, then the 24 months is moving in the future direction and you should be fine. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
I'm sorry, so if, like, for example, say you submitted your project maybe in June,
Yes.
does that mean June of '23? Would that mean that, I understand it would be out of the Kentucky budget for 2024, but would that mean that you could not start your project until then?
No. So you can, if, let's say, for example, you submit June, you'd be technically submitting June 2023, but you would be in the 2024 allocation fiscal year. So the funding that we would allocate for you is coming out of our 2024 budget. You can submit at any time. We will review and issue approvals, and you can start work anytime you have an approval in hand.
Oh, okay.
You just will not get your letter that says we've allocated this much money from you until the following fiscal year, 2024 fiscal year, the year that you're...
Would it be then July
Yes.
2024? Okay.
Yes, correct.
I may be jumping ahead.
No.
That's fine if I am, but what's your experience in terms of, I mean, you say that it's very popular and that, you know, so projects haven't really been getting 30%, then they've been getting something less than that.
Correct. Up until this point, we have not had the budget to fully allocate people to what they're eligible for.
Okay, so now we have this bunch of money. Do you have any idea what the actual reimbursement will be,
Yes,
percentage-wise?
yes. And it corresponds to this slide, so I'm really glad that that's a good
Okay.
segue. So
I meant to do that.
So of the $100 million, because in the past we've had a lower budget and everyone has had to get a smaller piece of pie than they're truly eligible for. And that wasn't really fair to the applicants, but unfortunately we just didn't have the funding to make a change. In this new legislative change that gave us $100 million, they saw a need to specifically allocate certain money for owner-occupied residences. Because homeowners, the thought process was, homeowners shouldn't be pushed out of what they're eligible for because of huge $50 million projects. So, of the 100 million, 25% is dedicated exclusively for owner-occupied residential. So I do not anticipate in this year or any coming year that the owner-occupied residential, we will get enough applications to exhaust that 25 million for owner-occupied. So it's, you know, not making promises, but it's safe to say if you're an owner-occupied residential and you come through the program, you will likely be allocated the full amount that you're eligible for. The only properties, all these other properties, which includes your income producing, your others, your structures, your tax exempt entities, they all have to share this 75% pool. So there is a possibility that if you're in these other property pools, that you may be allocated less than you're eligible for. However, since our budget is so much bigger, it will be a lot better than it has been in the past. In the past, we've had 5 million, just to give that perspective. We now have 100 million. So going back to the allocations, those, you know, our fiscal year is from July to July 1 to July 1. So we send out allocation letters that explicitly tell you and promise you, we've set aside, we've allocated this much money for your project. And those forms, those allocation letters are sent out in late June. Yes?
So the 24-month window, does that start on April 29th or June 29th?
That starts whenever you get an approval in hand. So you can submit, we will review and issue approvals and conditions at any time of the year. That April 29th deadline is really only important if being in a certain funding year is important to you in your timeline. And really, it really only applies if you're trying to retroactively capture credits, which again is not best practice, but we do approve projects that have done that. Yes?
So really, that April is really only good, like, for your tax money. Because really, in 2024 is when you're gonna see that tax credit when you do your state taxes.
You will
It'll
get,
be claimed in
yes,
2024.
if you complete the work. So when you complete the work, you'll submit the Part 3 application. We will certify that the work is done, and that's when we send it to the Department of Revenue and to you, saying that the credits have been awarded. And you can apply your tax credits to the year that it was awarded.
Awarded.
Yes.
And it was awarded in 2024 because 2023 is cut off right now, because
Right.
you said it was cut off in.
No, I get where there is a slight discrepancy though,
Yeah.
because this has to do with how we allocate the funding aside for you. Essentially, we're putting it aside for you. But when we actually award you the credits and it comes off of your income taxes, that is done when the project is complete.
Oh,
So
okay.
that may be in 2 years from now, that may be 24 months from now, that may be, depending on when your project is. Exactly. Yeah.
Quickly, at the time you were given your approval, which is not necessarily the time you're given your allocation letter, you do not necessarily know exactly what you've been allocated, you just know you will be allocated something.
Correct, correct. And like I said, owner occupied, that piece of the pie is pretty secure. But the others, it may be apportioned down and you may get slightly less than you're eligible for. There are per project budget caps. So, you know, if you come into our program, there's a minimum investment and then there's a maximum that we can award you. So for owner occupied, there is that minimum $20,000 investment that I said. And if you spend $400,000 in QREs, qualifying rehabilitation expenses, you'll be eligible for $120,000 in tax credits, and that's the maximum. So if you feel that your project is going to be greater than $400,000, you may want to do one project for a certain amount, and then the next time, once you're done with all that work, submit again for, to capture the remaining credits. Because we can only issue 120,000 in credits per project at the state level for owner-occupied residential. For all other properties, there's a $10 million credit maximum. And these are for typically your very large commercial properties. And again, those have to be the adjusted basis. So usually they're buildings that are in really bad shape, have very low property values. And because they're in such bad shape and have such low property values, we have that $10 million opportunity for investment. So QREs versus non-QREs, and can I have both? Yes, you should list all of your scopes of work on your application, but only some of those scopes may qualify for rehabilitation tax credits. And essentially, anything that goes towards the basis of the building and rehabilitating the historic structure count as QREs. Non-QREs, we have this sort of cute saying of if you turn the building upside down and shake it, anything that falls out is a non-QRE. So think curtains, appliances, fencing, yard work, anything that happens outside of the structure itself, furniture, anything that would sort of fall out or is considered impermanent would be non-QREs. Yes?
So porches are included.
Historic porches are included, but if you're building a new porch that was not a historic, that doesn't have historic precedent, then that would be a non-QRE.
What about carports that are attached to the building?
Again, if it's restoring a historic element, so if the house previously had a carport, then that would be considered restoring an element that was lost.
What if the carport is in very bad condition and has to be replaced? Would that still be covered?
That could potentially be covered. That's a bit of a gray area. We would have to review the property and see if the carport is a contributing feature to the historic property, or if it's because if it's like a contemporary sort of aluminum carport, to a 19th century property, then it probably would not.
Well, it is,
Okay.
but it's an old contemporary. I mean,
Okay.
I lived there like 46 years and it was there when I moved there.
Okay. Yeah, it very well could. It's we would just have to review that on a case by case. And a lot of things about this program. The program is meant to be vague and general so that it can help and cover a lot of people's properties. We have a lot of diverse properties here in Kentucky, from log cabins to high, Victorian Queen Anne architecture. So the program, while it can sometimes be frustrating that there isn't like a black and white answer to a lot of things, it's meant to be vague to help as many people as possible. Question?
Furnaces and water heaters.
Furnaces and water heaters count. Yes, those are considered fixtures, but appliances, go ahead. But appliances do not count. And it's in the weeds of things. It's more clearly defined by the IRS, by things that depreciate at a certain rate, and appliances they've determined depreciate at such a rate that they should not qualify.
Also, they can be removed when you remove.
Exactly, and a lot of these are things that, if you were to install curtains, those could be taken out immediately after, so, yeah.
This kind of gets back to my earlier question about what qualifies, or, filling out part one of the, program. And you said that it needed to either be on the National Historic Register or in a National Historic Area, which, like Newport, I'm thinking Mansion Hill or something like that. But you just mentioned something about log cabins, which I'm thinking typically that isn't something that's other, unless, Abe Lincoln ate lunch there one time. I don't know if that's necessarily, not all log cabins are on a historic register, or are, isn't on a special road that there's a bunch of log cabins. So does that only apply to when you're going for the federal, or is it?
No, the qualifier for both state and federal is that you're listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And we do have some historically significant log cabins, believe it or not.
Oh, sure.
I was just reviewing one the other day from 1785, which is pretty insane. But they're usually individually listed. To your point, they're typically not in a district of cabins. They're typically individually listed for their association with something.
It's like, we have a farm that was recognized back during the Kentucky bicentennial as a historic family farm, which it's not, it's, I guess, somewhat of a state recognized historic thing, but not, since it wouldn't be on the national, then that would not qualify.
Right, yeah, the farm program is a great one to sort of celebrate and recognize historic farms, but it does not automatically include you on the National Register. Yeah.
So we should have invited the one dinner for lunch then.
Sure. Yeah. So after you've completed the project, you've done all the work, that's when you send us the application saying that you've completed your work. That's the part 3. You provide us after photos, and that's when we as staff take a look at your before photos, your after photos, and make sure that everything that you said you were going to do was done, or maybe if you added some things, was it done appropriately? And you also provide, you don't have to provide your actual receipts, but you do need to provide an itemized list, which is provided to you on the form of what your expenses were. And the total of all of your expenses is what we then send to the Department of Revenue. This form, again, there's the state form and then the federal form. We do preliminary review of both, and we would then send the federal form up for you with our recommendation that it either be approved with conditions, very rarely, but sometimes denied. So yeah, that's the part 3 application after the project is done. I've included some resources here, namely our website, which contains application guides, photo documentation guides, step-by-step of the whole process. It also includes our contact information, which I've included up here. This one-pager, you're welcome to, I've got a few of these up here. This is sort of a one-page breakdown of the state and federal programs. This is also available on the website as a PDF. So if you have any questions, I would say your first bet is to look at the website. Second bet is to email me. So I know we took some questions throughout the presentation, but are there any final thoughts or, yeah?
If you are thinking about like foundation, because your house is 100 years old, you always got some kind of foundation issues. Should you call in an engineer, and could that be part of your?
Absolutely, yes. Fees associated with architects, engineers, consultants, those are all qualifying expenses. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, just a couple. One, you said that fences were out, but in my case, I have this nice historic home that at one time the past owner cut down all the wrought iron fences and sold, and to sell them because he was just running out of funds, and put up chain link. And it's just not what the house had or what it needs. Would that be something that would qualify?
Possibly, because it would be restoring
Right.
a previous feature.
And you can see everywhere where the
Right.
chain link
Well,
fence, where the
yeah.
wrought iron used to
Used to
be.
be, and I know that several of the historic districts here in Newport specifically call out the wrought iron fences as character defining features. So even though they're outside of the property, if you were to restore that feature, we could possibly capture that.
Okay.
So yeah, that one could be a possibility.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I have some work plans that show that at one time, a door was turned into a window, and a window was turned into a door. And basically what they did was they took the servants area out because there weren't servants anymore. And so there was no need for them to exit out this back door, and they put it on the side, and it doesn't look right, it doesn't work, you know, and we would like to move it back. Would that be something that might qualify?
Yeah, I think if there's historic evidence.
Oh, yeah, there's-
Then absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just say that the two things is providing that historic documentation, saying that you're restoring an element,
Right.
and then also making sure that you meet that $20,000 minimum.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, good one. Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. You had a question?
So, this was kind of in follow-up because in the Buena Vista National Register district that was just done a few years ago, which is probably the youngest National Register district in this area, there were probably, I guess, 100 or 200 things like fences and everything called out.
Yeah.
If they're attached to a house, do you actually call out, because they also all got their CPN number. So do you actually call those out as part of that registry to be able to include that?
So if they're on the same parcel of land, then we would review them as a whole application. But if they're separate, then they may individually qualify for the program. Like if the fence is on a separate parcel, then they could qualify for the program as another structure.
So maybe somebody owns two parcels.
Yeah.
One has a house on it, the other one doesn't, but they share an iron fence. That would work, but you would still need to reference the one on the vacant lot, correct?
Yeah, I think you would need to reference we have a National Register coordinator who confirms our eligibility for us, and yeah, he would probably just confirm that wrought iron fence is a resource, either individually or part of the district, and confirm that it's on, confirm ownership, because obviously we can't allow someone who doesn't own that to alter it or to submit an application. So if they own both parcels, the same owner, then we could probably most likely include that.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
Just wanted to ask you about the feasibility of loans, being home equity or, rehabilitation for some of this work. I assume that it's allowed.
Yeah, so how you pay for the project, we don't really get into. Just let us know how much you think it's going to cost, and then on the back end of the project, let us know how much it actually costs. But we don't really get involved or give any sort of financial advice as to how it's funded. Yeah.
I figured and I hope that, but
Yeah.
there's some small things like, well, you can't do that. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.